Although there are a variety of attenuation shapes to choose from, and we have control over how sounds fall off over distance, there will still be some circumstances where it's difficult to make the sounds fit naturally into the geometry of a particular game level. An example of this would be a smaller room within a larger room, or a complex building with rain outside. Trying to sculpt those ambient sounds around the outside of this building according to the different shapes so that the rain did not come through the walls is going to be a really tricky task. In the ambient sound design section of course 1, we saw how you could handle these kinds of situations with a switching system on entrances and exits. So when you go into a space, you fade out the outside sounds and fade in the inside sounds, and vice versa. This is a partial solution and is still widely used, but perhaps a better one could be found using the ambient zone function of audio volumes. Bookmark 7 takes us to cave 2, and at the far end of the cave there's a large waterfall. Now, in order for this to feel natural as we're approaching, you can see it's got quite a large fall off distance here. But there is a hidden passageway behind the cave where we might expect quite a lot of that sound to be blocked or occluded by these rocks. So that fall off distance is not going to feel right when coming from this direction. Let's have a quick listen. So we can hear these magical spells playing, and in the distance is waterfall. We'd expect to hear it from this kind of distance, and obviously get louder as we come up towards it. From behind in this hidden passageway, that volume drop off just doesn't feel right. Now, the audio volumes we've been using for reverb have an additional functionality that's going to help us here, and that's the ambient zone function. So I'll go to a side view and I'm going to remove some things on the upper level so that we can see things a bit more clearly. I'm going to press H to hide them. Now we can see this passageway between cave 2 and cave 3. So what I'm going to do is create an audio volume, put that into the passageway there, do some slight change of angle and scale so that it encompasses the whole passageway. So I might add a reverb to this, but what we're focused on for the moment is the ambient zone functionality. So you can see here in the details panel, we've got the reverb that we've looked at already, but now we're talking about the ambient zone, and it's got these settings for exterior and interior. The exterior settings represent how sounds that are exterior to the audio volume are treated. In other words, when we are inside the audio volume, then sounds coming from outside what might be a room might be quieter or have some filtering applied. And we can make these come into effect over certain periods of time as we enter the audio volume. The interior settings represent how sounds that are interior to the audio volume are treated. So when we are outside the audio volume or outside a room, the sounds that are inside it, again, might be quieter or have filtering applied. Coming back to our audio volume in the level, we'll give it a name. So we'll call it Behind Waterfall. And the other thing we need to do before we start applying any of these settings is just make sure that this audio volume will be used. Now, you might remember from the reverb video that we can set different priorities so that we can have audio volumes within other audio volumes. You can see this large audio volume encompassing the whole of these two caves. That's set at a priority of 0. So if we want this one to take effect when it's within that other one, then we need to set that as a higher priority. We'll set that to be 1. So the waterfall sound here is exterior to the audio volume that we're going to be walking into. So we'll set that exterior volume to something like 0.3. We'll have it take effect over 1.5 seconds. So that might work depending on the speed of your character. You need to experiment with this and see what feels natural as we cross these thresholds. And let's just see how that sounds. So as we come into this hidden passageway behind the waterfall, we get that sense that the sound of the waterfall is being occluded by the rocks, and as we come back out again, now like the reverbs, we can actually experiment with these settings in real time. So I'll shift and F1 to get mouse control, select my audio volume, and let's see what a bit of filtering sounds like. We applied a bit of a low pass filter there, which further enhances this feeling that we're now in a tunnel behind the waterfall itself. So this filtering can be quite useful to use sometimes independently of volume, because imagine if you're in a building and the walls are made of concrete, so you'd expect the volume and the high frequencies of the sound to be significantly attenuated. But if your game was set, for example, in a traditional Japanese house where rooms are partitioned by paper walls, then it may be that the emphasis is more on the filtering of the sound with only a very subtle volume drop. Like the reverb, we do need to make sure that our sounds are set up correctly so that audio volumes are applied to them. So we need to check the sound class of our sounds. So for example, this is playing this waterfall sound. We'll open it up and check its sound class in the sound queue. You can see here it's set to source loops. And if we edit that sound class, we can see that that particular sound class has reverb enabled, but for ambient zones, which is what we're using for this occlusion technique, we need apply ambient volumes to also be enabled. If your sound class does not have that enabled, you won't hear the effect of ambient zones. You also might want to think carefully about sounds that you might exclude from this function. So for example, if there's sounds that are really important from a gameplay perspective that we hear at all times, then you might choose not to apply these ambient zone settings to those particular sounds. So they might belong to a sound class that does not have apply ambient volumes enabled. We've seen how we can use the ambient zones functionality with the audio volume actor. This can get around the problem of audio bleeding inappropriately through game geometry, but it's also an important part of setting up your level so that it better reflects how sound is occluded by different materials in the game. As with reverb, we should also remember that game geometry is not necessarily always fixed, and we may need to adapt ambient zones dynamically.